I have lived in Savannah my entire life. Long enough to watch the oaks along the river grow thick with Spanish moss, and the world around me change in ways I never quite expected. When I was young, I thought stability meant keeping everything the same. But life has a way of teaching you that change doesn't ask for permission. My name is Margaret Langford. Though most people just call me Maggie. I'm 70 now. Retired from teaching. And for the first time in years, I've started to enjoy the quiet again. I wake up early, drink my coffee on the porch, and watch the world move at a slower pace. My husband, Robert, passed away 8 years ago. He left behind a small bakery downtown, a few savings, and a home that feels too big for one person. After his death, I promised myself I'd take care of the things he built, especially the money we saved together. Robert always said we worked too hard to let anyone take advantage of us. Back then, I didn't realize how prophetic those words would become. My only son, Ethan, lives about 20 minutes away. He's 38. A gentle soul who works as a financial advisor for a small firm near River Street. He's smart but soft-hearted, a quality he got from his father. When he met Amber, everything about his life seemed to brighten. She was younger than him by nearly 10 years, with long blonde hair and that kind of confidence that fills a room. The first time he brought her over for dinner, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. She arrived wearing a silk dress and high heels, far too tall for the old steps of my porch. She smiled wide, all teeth, and called me Mrs. Langford like she was meeting royalty. I told her to call me Maggie, but she kept using my full name. Said it sounded more sophisticated. I remember she brought a bottle of expensive wine, the kind people buy to impress, not to enjoy. Robert would have seen right through her. Over dinner, she talked almost nonstop about her job in marketing, her connections in Atlanta, her plans for travel once she and Ethan saved enough. Every time she spoke, her hand found its way to his arm, her laugh too sharp, her compliments too sweet. She was charming, yes, but I've lived long enough to know charm can hide many things. After they left that night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought about Robert. He always said Ethan would need someone grounded, a partner who shared his values. Amber didn't feel grounded. She felt like a storm pretending to be sunshine. Still, Ethan was happy, and that was enough for me to keep my opinions to myself. A few months later, they were engaged. He called me one evening, nervous but excited, and said he'd proposed during dinner at the Grey. I congratulated him, tried to sound cheerful, but inside, something twisted. When I met her family at the engagement party, my concern deepened. Her father was polite but distracted, more interested in the bourbon bar than his daughter's future. Her mother, apparently, was out of the picture. No relatives, no old friends. Just Amber surrounded by Ethan's co-workers and my bridge club ladies who didn't quite know what to make of her. The wedding came quickly. She wanted a big ceremony at a historic inn outside Savannah. Ethan, bless his heart, tried to keep it modest. But she was persuasive. I ended up writing a check for nearly $20,000, telling myself it was my wedding gift to them. She called it an investment in family memories. I called it foolish generosity. After the wedding, they moved into a house in a nice neighborhood near Ardsley Park. I helped them furnish it, gave them a few heirlooms from my home, Robert's armchair, a crystal vase from our anniversary trip. I wanted them to have roots, to feel settled. But within months, I started noticing changes. Ethan stopped visiting as often. When he did, he looked tired, distracted. Amber, on the other hand, grew bolder. She started calling me to ask about my investments, saying she wanted to make sure Ethan learned to manage family wealth properly. I told her politely that Robert and I had handled our finances just fine without outside help. She laughed. Said times were different now. That older people sometimes didn't realize how much they could be earning if they modernized their approach. Something in me froze when she said that. The way she looked at me while she spoke. Like she was appraising a house she already owned. I brushed it off. But I started paying attention. One Sunday, Ethan invited me over for dinner. Amber served lobster tails and champagne. I asked what they were celebrating. And she said she'd been promoted at work. Now, a senior partner at her agency. The way she talked about her salary, her travel plans, her new contacts, it all felt rehearsed. Ethan sat beside her, smiling faintly, saying little. After dinner, she led me to the living room to show off a new chandelier they'd had installed. It's Italian, she said proudly. Hand-blown glass. I couldn't help asking how they could afford it. She smiled and said, "Smart investments." My stomach turned. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went through my old account books, my statements, the paperwork Robert and I had kept neatly in a cedar box. Everything was where it should be. But something told me not to ignore my instincts. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle changes in Ethan's tone whenever we talked. He started asking odd questions about my will, about who managed my accounts, about whether I ever thought of simplifying things for the family's sake. I asked him where these questions were coming from. He hesitated before saying, Amber thought it might be smart to make sure everything was organized. That was the moment I knew she was planning something. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I've learned in my 70 years that you never confront a liar until you have proof. Instead, I began to quietly gather information. I called my banker, Sophie, a woman I've known since she was a teller, fresh out of college. I asked her to keep an eye on any unusual activity in my accounts. She promised she would. Then, I waited. I played the part of the sweet, trusting mother-in-law. I baked cookies, brought over flowers, asked about their work. I laughed when Amber told stories, nodded when she offered advice I didn't need. But inside, I was watching, listening, waiting for the mask to slip. It didn't take long. One afternoon, while dropping off a pie, I found Ethan alone, sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. He looked worn down, like a man carrying a weight too heavy to name. I sat beside him and asked if he was all right. He said he was just tired, that work had been stressful. But when I asked where Amber was, he said she was at a client meeting. That was the same phrase Robert used to use when one of his colleagues was out drinking instead of working. My heart sank. I wanted to tell him everything I suspected, but I didn't. He wasn't ready to hear it. And I didn't have proof yet. So I hugged him, told him he could always come home if he needed to. He smiled weakly and said he was fine. But as I left, I saw his hands trembling. I knew something was breaking. And not just his marriage. On the drive home, I made myself a promise. If Amber thought age had made me soft, she was about to learn how wrong she was. I may be 70, but I've lived through loss, illness, and heartache. I know how to survive storms. And this one, I decided, would not drown me. A week after the wedding, the house felt quieter than ever. The flowers had wilted. The champagne glasses were boxed up. And all that remained were the photos of Ethan and Amber smiling like the world belonged to them. I wanted to be happy for my son, but something inside me refused to settle. It was a small, uneasy whisper. The kind that doesn't stop, no matter how much you tell yourself you're just being paranoid. Amber called me the following Sunday. Her voice, sugary sweet. She wanted to come by. Said she had baked a pecan pie for me. I laughed softly to myself. The girl had never baked anything before the wedding. And now, she was Betty Crocker. When she arrived, she looked perfect as always. Hair curled. Perfume expensive. She placed the pie on the table and said she wanted to help me organize my finances. Said Ethan was worried about me managing everything alone at my age. I smiled and told her, gently, that I had been handling my books long before she was born. Her face didn't flinch, but her eyes did. That night, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker over the oak trees. The air was heavy and humid, the way it gets before a storm. I tried to shake off the feeling that had been building since I first met her. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was just lonely. A few days later, my neighbor Elaine stopped by. She's a widow like me, tough as nails, the kind of woman who sees everything that happens on the block. She leaned on my fence and said she'd seen Amber downtown at a coffee shop. Not with Ethan, but with some younger man she didn't recognize. They looked close, she said. Real close. I tried to laugh it off. Told her it was probably a client. But when Elaine left, the pie in my stomach turned sour. That evening, I called Ethan. He was working late again. As usual, I asked how things were. Tried to keep my tone light. He told me everything was fine. That Amber was working hard to start her own PR business. He sounded proud, almost relieved that she was so driven. I didn't have the heart to tell him what Elaine had said. A few weeks went by, and Amber kept finding reasons to visit. She would help with little things, like balancing my checkbook or setting up online payments. I appreciated the thought, but it bothered me that she always wanted my laptop, my passwords, my numbers. She said it would be easier if she set up automatic transfers, that I didn't need to worry about a thing. One day she laughed and said I probably didn't even remember all my passwords anyway. I smiled back, but my hands tightened around the teacup I was holding. I decided to keep quiet and watch. Old age teaches you that silence is sometimes the best weapon. One evening, I visited Ethan and Amber's new townhouse in Atlanta. The place looked like something out of a magazine, full of glass and velvet. Everything color coordinated. I noticed the new furniture, the crystal chandelier, the framed photos from their honeymoon in Aruba. Ethan greeted me with a hug, his eyes tired but warm. Amber handed me a glass of wine and said she had been redecorating non-stop. She laughed and said Ethan spoiled her too much. Dinner was beautiful. Lobster tails and champagne. Too beautiful for their salaries. I mentioned how lovely everything looked, and Amber said, with that smooth confidence of hers, that her company had landed new clients and she was making more than she ever expected. She winked at me across the table and said, "Success comes to those who dare." I nodded. But in my head, I could hear Robert's old voice, warning me about people who talk too easily about money. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The math didn't add up. Ethan's job paid well, but not that well. And Amber's new business had barely launched. The way she looked at me across that table, like she was already 3 steps ahead, left a chill running down my spine. A few days later, I got an email alert from my bank about a small online payment linked to a company name I didn't recognize. It wasn't much, maybe a few $100s. But it was strange. I decided to check my account more carefully the next morning. When I logged in, the layout looked different. The security questions had changed. I frowned. I hadn't updated any of it. That afternoon, Amber called again, saying she wanted to show me how to use a new banking app. I told her I was fine, that I'd managed just fine before apps even existed. She laughed. The same laugh she used when she wanted to sound patient but smug. Then she said, "Mom, it's okay. You don't have to understand everything. Just let me handle it." The word mom stuck in my throat. It didn't sound like affection. It sounded like possession. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice in my head. That slow drawl, when she said I didn't have to understand everything. Maybe she was right about one thing, though. I didn't understand her. Not one bit. A week later, Ethan invited me for dinner again. This time I brought a bottle of wine. When I arrived, the house gleamed even more. New artwork. New gadgets. Everything expensive. Amber came down the stairs in a silk blouse, glowing with that kind of beauty money can buy. I asked Ethan quietly if everything was going well financially. He looked proud. Said they were managing fine, that Amber had great connections and found amazing deals. I smiled at him, but inside, I felt a knot forming. He didn't notice the hesitation in his own voice. He didn't see how easily she filled the space between us. During dinner, Amber talked about travel, about seeing the world while they were still young. She said life was short and we should spend it enjoying, not saving. Ethan laughed and squeezed her hand. I pretended to laugh too. But all I could think about was how hard Robert and I had worked so that Ethan could have choices. Choices he now seemed to be giving away without even realizing it. After dessert, Amber started clearing the plates. I watched her for a moment. Graceful. Confident. The perfect wife. She looked over her shoulder and said, "You should take a trip too. Maggie. Maybe a cruise. You'd love it." I shook my head and said I was fine right where I was. She smiled. That practiced little smile of hers. "Such a big house for one person," she said softly, almost to herself. "Must get lonely." As I drove home, her words echoed in my head. Such a big house for one person. I realized she had said that exact thing the night of the wedding too. It wasn't concern. It was curiosity. Calculation. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and stood at the window, watching the rain start to fall. I didn't know exactly what she was planning, but I knew she was planning something. And I promised myself that if she was bold enough to play with me, I'd make sure she'd regret it. The next morning, I woke up early with a heaviness in my chest I couldn't explain. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The numbers on the screen made my stomach twist. There were transfers I didn't remember making. Small at first, then larger ones. All labeled under a company name I had never seen before. Crimson Media, LLC. I called the bank's customer service line, but the young man on the phone spoke too fast. Used words that didn't make sense. And finally told me to visit a local branch if I wanted to dispute anything. I grabbed my purse, drove across town, and walked straight into Wells Federal Bank. The air was cold and smelled like carpet cleaner and new money. The teller directed me to a desk where a young woman with a bright smile greeted me. Her name tag said Sophie Adams. I told her what I had found. She listened carefully, tapping on her keyboard. After a few minutes, she frowned and asked if I had added a joint account holder recently. I said no. Never. She turned her screen slightly toward me. My breath caught. There it was. My name, and right below it, another name added with full access privileges. Amber Langford. I felt a wave of heat rise through me. My hands trembled. Sophie said softly that the signature on the authorization matched mine perfectly. I asked if it was a paper signature or electronic. She said electronic. Through online banking authorization. I told her I never signed any online authorization in my life. She printed out copies and said we could start a fraud report if I wanted. I sat there, staring at my name next to hers. It was like seeing a stranger wearing my face. When I got back to my car, I just sat behind the wheel. People walked past carrying their groceries, their coffee, living normal lives. I felt like the ground had tilted beneath me. I wanted to call Ethan. But what would I say that his wife had stolen from me, that I had been right all along? He would defend her. He always did. That night I made soup, but couldn't eat. Around 7. There was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Amber was standing there, smiling like a Hallmark card, holding a box of pastries. She said she was in the neighborhood and wanted to check on me. I invited her in because I needed to see her face. She walked around the living room, complimenting the furniture. asking about the garden, making herself comfortable as if nothing was wrong. I watched her every move. She finally sat down and started chatting about a new business opportunity she was pursuing. I listened. Quiet. Until I couldn't stand it anymore. I said her name and she looked up. Still smiling. I told her I had gone to the bank that morning. For the first time. The smile on her face faltered. Just for a second. Then it came back. Smoother than before. She asked if everything was all right. I told her about the joint account. About the electronic signature that looked like mine. She leaned back and laughed softly. Shaking her head like I was an old lady mixing up her pills. She said, "Oh, Maggie. That must be a system error. I've been helping Ethan move some funds for his business. Maybe the bank got the names mixed up. It happens all the time with these online forms." She reached for my hand. Her nails perfectly manicured. "You don't need to stress yourself over this tech stuff. Let me handle it for you." I pulled my hand back. I said I would rather deal with the bank myself. Her smile thinned. She said, "Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable. But maybe you should take it easy. You've got a lot on your mind these days." She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned and said lightly, "You know, sometimes you imagine things when you don't fully understand them." When she was gone, I stood there, staring at the door, hearing her voice repeat in my head, "You don't fully understand." I walked back to the table and picked up the papers Sophie had printed. The proof was right there in black and white. No matter how many ways I looked at it, there was only one conclusion. She had done it deliberately, and she thought I was too old to fight back. Later that night, I took out an old photo album from the shelf. There was a picture of Robert and me in front of the bakery we had built from nothing. We were younger, poorer, and full of grit. I remembered the nights we stayed up, balancing ledgers by hand. The days we sold pies out of the back door because we couldn't afford the rent yet. I had handled every cent of our money then, and no one ever fooled me. I wasn't about to start being fooled now. The next morning, I called Sophie again and asked her to freeze any further transfers. She said she would flag the account and notify her supervisor. I thanked her and told her to keep this confidential. After that call, I made another, to Helen Porter. We'd been friends since college, and she had worked as a lawyer before retiring. She picked up on the second ring and said she could hear something in my voice. I told her everything. There was silence for a moment. Then her tone changed. Calm but sharp. She said, "Maggie, you need to document everything. Every transaction. Every name. Every date. Don't confront her yet. If she's bold enough to steal, she'll try to cover it up. Let her dig the hole herself." I felt calmer hearing her voice. She had always been the practical one, the strategist. She promised to stop by the next day with a folder and a plan. That evening, I saw Ethan's car pull into their driveway across town on my security camera feed. I watched him carry groceries inside. Then Amber followed, laughing, brushing his arm. She looked radiant, carefree. I imagined the money she had taken paying for those new clothes. That perfect hair, those manicured nails. It burned inside me. Not just the betrayal, but the arrogance. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the dark, thinking about what Helen had said. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to lose control. That was what Amber expected from an old woman. She wanted me to act fragile, to prove her right. Instead, I would wait. I would watch. And when the time was right, I would remind her that experience beats youth every single time. Outside, the rain started again, tapping against the window. I closed my eyes and listened, steadying my breath. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the beginning of something very different. Helen arrived the next morning with her usual efficiency. Hair pulled back, legal pad in hand, and that sharp look in her eyes that always made people sit up straight. She sat at my kitchen table, poured herself a cup of coffee, and said we were going to handle this quietly and smartly. She asked me to show her the documents from the bank. I laid them out carefully. Every page, every transaction highlighted. She scanned them one by one, nodding slowly. After a while she looked up and said, the signature authorization was a clear case of fraud. The tricky part would be proving intent. Amber could claim confusion or say she signed something Ethan mentioned and didn't realize what it was. Helen told me to act normal around both of them, to keep attending family dinners, to stay friendly. She said we would gather evidence until there was no way out for her. The idea of pretending made my stomach turn. But Helen was right. I wasn't going to win this by storming in. I would win it by patience. That weekend, Ethan called and invited me over for Sunday dinner. I could tell from his voice that Amber had orchestrated it. I agreed, took a deep breath, and put on my calmest smile. When I arrived, she was dressed in a soft cream dress, hair perfect as always. She greeted me with a hug and told me she had made her famous lemon chicken. I didn't know she even knew how to cook chicken. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Small talk about the weather, neighbors, and Ethan's work. Then Amber brought up travel again. She said she and Ethan were thinking of taking a short trip to the Caribbean. Something to unwind after all the stress of work. Ethan looked uncertain. Said they probably couldn't afford it right now. Amber smiled and said, "Don't worry. I've already sorted it out." That was my first real clue. She had found another way to fund her fun. After dinner, Ethan went outside to take a call. I stayed at the table, sipping tea. Amber cleared the plates and then, without looking up, asked how I was feeling these days. I said fine. She nodded, then said softly that if I ever got tired of managing the house alone, she and Ethan could help sell it. She mentioned a realtor she knew who specialized in properties like mine. Her tone was kind, but her eyes were measuring every word. I smiled and said that house was my heart, and I planned to die in it. She gave a polite laugh and said she understood. Then she added, "But you never know. Life changes fast." That night I called Helen and told her everything. She said it was time to dig deeper. She had a contact, a private investigator named Tom Heller, who had worked with her firm for years. He could find out if Amber was hiding anything. I agreed immediately. The next day, Tom called me. His voice was rough but professional. He said he would start by checking Amber's business, Crimson Media LLC. Within 3 days he called back. The company was real but practically empty. No office, no employees, just a P.O. box and a few fake invoices. The transfers from my account were listed as client deposits. He said whoever set it up knew what they were doing. Tom also mentioned that Amber was often seen meeting a man at a cafe downtown near Peachtree Street. They met in the afternoons when Ethan was at work. The man was younger, mid-30s, stylish, and according to Tom's sources, a photographer named Jason Cole. My blood ran cold when he said they looked affectionate, not businesslike. I sat in silence after that call, feeling both anger and pity. Anger at her nerve, pity for my son. That evening I stopped by Ethan's house unannounced. Amber opened the door, surprised but polite. She said Ethan was working late and asked if I wanted to come in. I stepped inside and noticed the faint smell of expensive perfume mixed with candle wax. There were 2 glasses of wine on the counter, one still half full. I asked if she had company. She smiled lightly and said a friend had dropped by to discuss a project. I looked at the glass again, but said nothing. She asked if I was okay, if something was wrong. I told her I was fine, just wanted to say hello. She smiled, that perfect plastic smile, and said she was glad I stopped by. I looked around at the lavish decor, the expensive rug, The new artwork, everything in that house, screamed indulgence. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture Robert and I had bought decades ago. The old wood floors creaked under my feet. I thought of Ethan as a boy, running through the same halls, his laughter echoing. I wondered where that boy had gone, how he could be so blind to what his wife was doing. Helen came by the next morning. She brought coffee and bagels and said Tom had found more. Amber had opened 2 credit cards in my name. Using information from some of my old documents, she must have found when helping me with finances. The balances were almost maxed out. Helen looked at me and said we needed to act soon. I told her I wasn't ready yet. Not until Ethan saw the truth with his own eyes. That afternoon, I went to the bank again and froze every account that had Amber's name on it. I told Sophie not to mention it to anyone until I said otherwise. She promised she wouldn't. Over the next week, I played the role of the sweet mother-in-law. I sent Amber recipes, complimented her outfits, even brought her flowers. Each time she smiled. I could see the victory in her eyes, the belief that she had fooled me completely. But underneath that calm, I was building a storm. One Thursday, I decided to drive past the cafe Tom had mentioned. I parked across the street and waited. After an hour, I saw her. Amber walked up wearing sunglasses and a white coat. The picture of elegance. Jason was already there, sitting at an outdoor table. When she reached him, they kissed quickly before sitting down. She laughed, touching his arm, her face glowing in a way I had never seen with Ethan. My chest tightened, but not from heartbreak. It was from certainty. I finally knew exactly who she was. I went home and called Helen again. She said we had enough to go to the police. But I wasn't ready for that. I wanted her to feel it first, to realize that underestimating me had been her biggest mistake. Helen hesitated, then said she understood. She told me to be careful, that people like Amber didn't play fair. That night I took out Robert's old journal from the drawer by my bed. He had always said that revenge should be quiet, clever, and absolute. I smiled to myself. Outside, the moonlight fell across the porch, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. I knew what needed to be done. It was just a matter of timing. The next few days I could barely sleep. I kept going over every detail, every sign I had ignored, every smile that had been a lie. Helen said we had enough evidence to build a legal case, but I told her I wanted to take one more step before that. I wanted Amber to trap herself completely. On Saturday morning, I called Ethan and asked if they would join me for dinner the following evening. He sounded happy. Said it had been too long since we all sat down together. I heard Amber's voice in the background, light and cheerful, saying she'd bring dessert. Perfect. That afternoon, I met Helen and Tom at a small diner on the edge of town. Tom handed me a thin folder with new photos. Amber and Jason at the airport ticket counter, laughing, holding hands. Another one of them in a jewelry store, looking at rings. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. I asked Tom when the photos were taken. He said the previous afternoon. He also told me that according to a travel agent's record, 2 first-class tickets had been booked under Jason Cole and Amber Langford for a cruise leaving from Miami in 5 days. Paid for using one of my accounts before it was frozen. I thanked him quietly and slid the folder into my purse. Helen reached across the table, her voice firm but kind. She said it was time to let the authorities handle it. I told her I would, but not before Amber understood who she was dealing with. Helen sighed but didn't argue. Sunday evening came faster than I expected. I set the table carefully, used Robert's old silver, the good china, lit the candles. I wanted it to feel like family again, at least for Ethan's sake. When the doorbell rang, I smoothed my blouse and took a deep breath. Ethan walked in first, holding a bottle of wine. Amber followed, radiant as ever. wearing a red dress that almost sparkled under the light. She kissed my cheek and said I looked lovely. I told her she did too. Though my voice felt tight in my throat, dinner started pleasantly. Ethan talked about work. Amber laughed at his jokes. And I smiled at all the right moments. For a while, it almost felt normal, but underneath the surface, every second was a test of patience. When dessert came, Amber set a tray of tiramisu on the table and said she made it herself. I smiled politely, thinking how strange it was that she always learned new skills when there was something to hide. As we ate, she asked about my plans for the summer. I said I was thinking of taking a trip. Maybe somewhere peaceful. Her eyes lit up, and she said she could recommend a few luxury cruises. That she and Ethan were planning one soon. I looked at Ethan, but he didn't seem to know anything about it. I said, "That sounds nice. But cruises aren't really my thing. I prefer to stay on solid ground." She laughed and said, "Sometimes you just have to let go and enjoy life. Maggie, you can't take your money with you." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No. But you can lose it faster than you think." For the first time, her smile slipped. Only for a moment. But I saw it. She recovered quickly, saying she didn't mean anything by it. Ethan looked confused, glancing between us. After dinner, Ethan went to the porch to take a call from work. Amber stayed behind, gathering plates. I watched her silently for a moment. Then I asked if she was excited about her upcoming trip. She froze, her hand still holding a dish. She turned slowly and asked what I meant. I said I had heard she and Jason Cole were going on a cruise from Miami next week. Her eyes went wide before she caught herself. She set the dish down, forced a laugh, and said Jason was a client. That I must have misunderstood. I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "Clients don't usually book first-class cruises with married women." The air in the room grew thick. She tried to say something, but I raised my hand. I told her I had pictures, receipts, and bank statements. I said I knew about Crimson Media, the fake invoices, and the forged authorization on my accounts. I told her that I had frozen every cent she tried to take. Her face drained of color. She tried to speak, but no words came. Then she looked toward the porch, where Ethan's voice was still faintly audible. Her eyes darted back to me. She whispered, "You can't tell him. It will destroy him." I felt a strange calm as I looked at her. I said, "I'm not the one who destroyed him." She straightened up, her voice cold now. Sharper. She said, "You don't know what it's like. You've had everything your whole life. You think money makes you moral, but you just hoard it. People like me have to fight for every inch. I didn't steal from you. I just took what should have been mine." I stared at her, stunned by how easily she twisted her crimes into righteousness. I said quietly, "You took my trust, my son's love, and my husband's legacy. You can't justify that." Before she could reply, Ethan came back inside. He looked at both of us. Sensing the tension, he asked what was going on. Amber quickly said we were just talking about finances, that I was worried about her handling some of my accounts. I said, "That's true, but we'll discuss it later." Ethan looked uneasy but nodded. They left soon after. Amber hugged me at the door, the gesture stiff and cold. She whispered, "You'll regret this, Maggie." Then she smiled at Ethan and walked to the car. I watched them drive away until the taillights disappeared. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From relief. The confrontation had stripped away every illusion. She knew that I knew. I sat down at the table and stared at the empty dessert plates. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock. I thought of Robert again, of how he always said that sometimes justice needs a little push. I smiled to myself. I had pushed enough for tonight. Tomorrow, I would finish what I started. When I went to bed, I placed Tom's folder on the nightstand beside me. The photos of Amber and Jason stared up from the manila paper. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet certainty. The storm was ready. All I had to do was decide when to let it break. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table staring at the manila folder again. The photos. The receipts. The documents. Proof of everything she had done. I traced my finger over her smiling face in one of the pictures and felt something colder than anger. Determination. Helen called around 8. She asked if I was ready to take it to the police. I told her not yet. I wanted to make one phone call first. One that would make everything fall into place. She didn't argue. By now she knew I had a plan. Even if she didn't like it. After breakfast, I drove downtown to the branch office of the travel agency, listed on the cruise booking. The clerk, a young man with bright hair and nervous energy, looked up when I gave him the names Jason Cole and Amber Langford. His smile faltered as he clicked through his computer. "Yes," he said. Their tickets were booked a week ago for a Mediterranean cruise. 2 weeks long. Suite cabin. Paid in full. I asked if there had been any changes or updates. He shook his head. I leaned closer and said quietly that there might be an issue with the card used for payment. And it would be best if the transaction was held for verification. I gave him my business card and told him I was the account holder. His eyes widened slightly when I mentioned fraud. And he said he'd flag the account immediately. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in months. She thought she had outsmarted me. But she was about to learn what happens when you underestimate a woman who has spent 70 years surviving everything life could throw her way. That evening, I called Tom. I told him about the cruise, the payment freeze, and asked if he could contact someone at the cruise line's port office. He said he had a friend there, a security coordinator. I told him I needed help setting a little trap. He laughed softly and said he liked the sound of that. For the next 2 days, I kept up appearances. I called Ethan, made small talk, asked if Amber was feeling better since she said she was under a lot of work stress. He said she'd been busy preparing for a conference in Chicago. I didn't correct him. He sounded tired, distant, but hopeful. I wanted to protect that hope a little longer before the truth shattered it. On the 3rd day, I met Tom and Helen at my house. Tom had arranged everything. The cruise line had confirmed that Amber and Jason would be checking in at the port in Miami the following afternoon. He had a contact ready to intercept them once they arrived. I told him exactly what I wanted done. When they checked into their hotel before the cruise, a package would be waiting in their suite, addressed to Amber Langford. Inside would be the photos, the bank statements, and a letter from me. Helen listened quietly as I read her the letter I had written. It was short, direct, and polite. Amber, I know everything. Every lie. Every dollar. Every kiss that didn't belong to you. The accounts are frozen. The cards are canceled. And the money you thought was yours never left my control. Enjoy the view from the room. It's the only luxury you'll be getting on this trip. Helen sighed when I finished reading. She said it was ruthless but fair. Tom just grinned and said it would make one hell of a show. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her face when she opened that envelope. I wasn't proud of how much I wanted to see it. But I couldn't deny it either. The next morning, I woke to a text from Tom. They're here. It read. I opened my laptop where he had set up a live link to a security feed in the hotel lobby. I watched Amber and Jason walk in together, laughing, their hands brushing as they checked in at the desk. She looked radiant in a white sundress. The picture of a woman about to start a dream vacation. The clerk handed her a keycard and a small package. She smiled, tucked it under her arm, and they walked toward the elevators. I sat in silence, waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally. Tom texted again. They opened it. He sent me a photo from the security feed. Amber was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. The folder open beside her. Papers scattered around her. Jason stood near the window. His expression tense. I could almost imagine their voices. Tom called a few minutes later. He said she had started yelling at Jason, accusing him of giving her away. Jason shouted back that she had promised him money. Then she grabbed her phone and tried to make a call. Probably to Ethan or the bank. But the cards were already blocked and the accounts locked. Tom said it was chaos. The hotel manager stepped in. And soon after, security came knocking on their door. I felt no joy. Just a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives in the form of consequences. By evening, Tom told me they had been escorted out of the hotel after the bank confirmed the fraud. Jason left first, furious, carrying a single bag. Amber followed soon after, pale and silent. He said she looked like someone who had finally realized the game was over. That night, Ethan came by unexpectedly. His face was pale, eyes red. I knew before he spoke that she had called him. He sat at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, she's gone." She left a voicemail saying she needed time away, that she felt trapped. I said softly, "I know." He looked at me sharply. "What do you mean you know?" I took a deep breath and handed him the folder. He opened it slowly, flipping through the photos, the statements, the receipts. His hands began to tremble. He asked if it was real. I nodded. He covered his face with his hands. I could hear his breathing, short and uneven. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "How long have you known?" I told him the truth. That I had suspected for months, but needed to be sure. He pushed the folder away and sat back, silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I loved her, Mom." "I know," I said, "and that's why I couldn't let her destroy you." We sat there until the light outside faded into dusk. The house was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Finally, he whispered, "What do I do now?" I reached across the table and took his hand. "You start over," I said. "You remember who you are, and you don't let her take that from you." He nodded, his shoulders heavy, but there was a steadiness in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. When he left that night, he hugged me tighter than he had since he was a boy. After he was gone, I poured myself a glass of wine and went out to the porch. The air was still, the sky full of quiet stars. I sat there for a long time, feeling the weight of it all lift slowly from my chest. She was gone. The damage she caused could finally start to heal. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The morning sun spilled through the curtains, soft and warm, the kind of light that usually meant peace. I stood by the kitchen window, sipping my coffee, but peace still felt like something I hadn't earned yet. The house was quiet, too quiet. And even though the storm had passed, there was a lingering ache in the air, like smoke after a fire. Ethan hadn't called in 2 days. I knew he needed time, space to process everything. He was grieving. Not just for his marriage, but for the illusion he'd built around it. I understood that kind of grief. It's the kind that doesn't just break your heart, but also makes you question your own judgment. Around noon, I heard a car pull up. I peeked through the blinds and saw Ethan's truck. He sat there for a long minute before getting out. His shoulders slumped, eyes hollow but calmer than before. When he came inside, I noticed he had shaved, and his clothes were clean, pressed. That small act alone told me he was trying to move forward. He sat down at the table, and I poured him coffee. For a while, we didn't say anything. Then he finally spoke. He said he had talked to a lawyer, that he wanted to file for divorce immediately. I asked if he was sure. He said yes. His voice steady. She had called him again. From an unknown number. Crying. Begging for another chance. But this time, he said he didn't feel pity anymore. He felt empty. I told him I was proud of him. He nodded but didn't smile. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes softening when they landed on the old family photos, still hanging on the wall. He asked if I remembered the fishing trip he and Robert had taken when he was 9. I said of course I did. That Robert had come home sunburned and bragging about how Ethan caught the biggest catfish in the lake. He laughed a little then. The first real laugh I'd heard from him in weeks. He said he wanted to start fresh. Maybe take some time off work. Do something different. I told him that sounded like exactly what he needed. Before he left, he hugged me and said he was thankful. That he finally understood why I'd done everything I did. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, feeling both relief and sadness settle over me like a blanket. Later that evening, Helen called. She said the fraud investigation was nearly finished. The bank had confirmed Amber's involvement, and law enforcement had frozen her remaining assets. Helen asked if I wanted to press criminal charges. I hesitated. I thought about the satisfaction of seeing her pay for what she'd done. But then I thought of Ethan. How exhausted he already was. How much damage had already been done. I told Helen I just wanted her out of our lives for good. Helen didn't argue. She said she'd make sure Amber was legally barred from contacting either of us again. After the call, I went to the porch with a glass of wine. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of honeysuckle from the fence. Fireflies blinked lazily in the dark. And somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent. I thought about Amber then. I wondered where she was. If she was still with that photographer or alone in some cheap motel, blaming everyone but herself. I didn't wish her well. But I didn't wish her pain either. She had created her own. 2 weeks passed quietly. Ethan came by more often. He helped me fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, trimmed the hedges, even cooked dinner one night. We were learning how to talk again. How to just be mother and son without the shadow of that woman between us. I could see him healing, piece by piece. One afternoon, while I was cleaning out the old filing cabinet in Robert's study, I found a dusty box labeled Investments. Inside were some of the old property papers Robert and I had bought years ago when we were saving for retirement. One of them was for a small lake house up near Blue Ridge. We had rented it out for years, and I had almost forgotten it existed. The thought came suddenly and clearly. Maybe that was exactly what Ethan needed. That evening, I told him about the place. His face softened when I mentioned it. He said he remembered going there as a teenager, fishing with Robert, building fires, sleeping under the stars. I handed him the key and told him it was his now. He protested, said he couldn't take it. But I insisted. I told him his father would have wanted it that way. The next morning, he left for the lake house. He called me when he got there. Said it was even more beautiful than he remembered. I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Hope. A few days later, Helen stopped by again. She said she had news. Amber's new boyfriend, Jason Cole, had been arrested in Miami on unrelated fraud charges. Apparently, he had scammed several clients with fake photography contracts. Helen smiled wryly and said karma works faster than the law sometimes. I asked about Amber. She said no one knew exactly where she was, but she had been seen leaving town alone. After Helen left, I sat in the quiet for a while, letting the news sink in. I wasn't surprised. People like Jason and Amber always find each other. They orbit the same kind of greed until one of them burns the other up. Still, I couldn't help but think how young she was, how easily she could have chosen differently. That night I pulled out one of Robert's old journals again. I found an entry he'd written years ago after a bad business betrayal. He wrote that sometimes the hardest part of justice isn't punishing others, but deciding when to stop fighting. Reading that, I realized I was finally ready to stop. The next morning, I drove out to the lake to see Ethan. The road wound through the trees, sunlight flickering through the leaves. When I arrived, he was out on the porch, painting the railing. He waved, smiling, and for the first time, he looked like himself again. We sat by the water for hours, watching the ripples catch the light. He talked about fixing up the cabin, maybe renting it out one day. Maybe not. I just listened, feeling grateful that, after all the lies, all the damage, we had found our way back to something real. When I drove home that evening, the sky was streaked with pink and gold. I thought about everything that had happened, how close I'd come to losing everything that truly mattered. But in the end, I hadn't lost it all. I had protected my family, my home, my peace. As I pulled into the driveway, I glanced at the porch light glowing softly in the dusk. It felt like a small promise, one I intended to keep. The porch light flickered once before settling into a steady glow, and I stood there for a while, keys still in my hand, listening to the quiet hum of the cicadas. The night air was warm, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth after a short evening rain. Everything felt still again, almost normal, and for the first time in a long time, that stillness didn't scare me. Over the next few weeks, life found its rhythm again. I tended the garden, replaced the broken fence post behind the garage, and even joined the church quilting circle I'd been avoiding for years. People asked about Ethan, and I told them he was up at the lake house, doing better every day. I didn't mention Amber, and no one asked. Small towns have a way of sensing when a story shouldn't be touched. One Saturday morning, I woke up early and drove to the farmer's market. The sun had just risen over the rooftops, painting everything in soft gold. I was picking out tomatoes when I heard someone call my name. It was Elaine, my neighbor, waving from across the aisle. She hurried over, her eyes wide with gossip barely contained. She said she had heard that Amber was back in town. My stomach tightened. I asked where she heard that, and she said someone saw her at the bus station, alone, carrying a single suitcase. I thanked her and paid for my tomatoes, but my mind was already racing. I hadn't expected her to return. I thought she'd disappear for good, like smoke. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee going cold in my hands. Part of me felt anger rise again, but another part just felt tired. People like Amber don't change, but they do break. And broken people sometimes come crawling back, not because they're sorry, but because they've run out of places to go. That afternoon, I decided to drive to town. If she was really back, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The bus station sat on the edge of downtown, near the old mill. I parked across the street and waited, feeling foolish and restless. For half an hour, nothing happened. Then I saw her. She was sitting on a bench outside the ticket counter, wearing a gray sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. The woman who once sparkled like a diamond now looked dull, brittle. She held her phone in one hand, staring at the screen like she didn't know what to do next. I didn't get out of the car. I just watched her for a while. A bus pulled up, doors hissing open, and people climbed aboard. Amber didn't move. She just sat there, staring into the distance. Eventually, she stood, looked around, and started walking down the sidewalk toward Main Street. I let her go. That evening, Ethan called. His voice sounded stronger, lighter. He said he was thinking of coming back into town soon. Maybe reopening his private practice, but keeping things smaller this time. I told him that sounded wonderful, and I could hear the quiet pride in his voice. Before we hung up, I almost told him about seeing Amber. But something stopped me. He was finally starting to heal. And I wouldn't risk opening that wound again. The next day, I went about my chores as usual. But late in the afternoon, as I was pulling weeds from the flower bed, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I looked up, my heart sank. It was her. Amber stepped out slowly, holding her purse close to her chest. She looked thinner, older, her eyes sunken and tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said softly that she just wanted to talk. I crossed my arms and told her I had nothing to say. She nodded, her eyes glistening. She said she knew that. But she needed to say something anyway. I told her she had 5 minutes. She started talking fast, words tumbling over each other. She said Jason had taken everything. That after Miami, he'd left her stranded with no money, no job, no friends. She said she had tried to fix things, tried to start over. But every door closed. She said she didn't come back for money. She just wanted forgiveness. I listened without interrupting, though every part of me wanted to shut the door and walk away. When she finished, she wiped her eyes and waited for me to speak. I looked at her and said forgiveness wasn't something I owed her. I told her she had already taken enough from this family, and the only decent thing she could do now was leave and never look back. Her lips trembled. She whispered that she understood. Then she looked around at the house, her gaze softening. She said she used to think this place was just another symbol of control, of wealth. Now she saw it was built on something stronger. I didn't reply. Before leaving, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. She placed it on the porch rail and said it was for Ethan. Then she walked back to her car and drove away without another word. I didn't open the envelope right away. That night, I sat by the kitchen window, the letter resting beside my cup of tea. Eventually, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. It said she was sorry, not because she was caught, but because she had ruined the one good thing she ever had. She said Ethan deserved peace and that she was leaving the country to start over. There was no signature, just the word goodbye. I didn't believe half of it, but it didn't matter. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she didn't. Either way, it was over. I placed the letter back in the envelope and set it aside for Ethan. A week later, Ethan returned home. He looked healthier, tanned from working outside, and more at ease than I'd seen him in years. I gave him the letter, and he read it quietly. When he finished, he folded it neatly and set it down. He said he didn't hate her anymore. He just didn't care. That was how he knew he was finally free. That evening, we cooked dinner together. The house filled with laughter again. Real laughter. The kind that comes when pain finally starts to fade. When he left that night, he hugged me tight and told me he loved me. I told him I loved him too, and that his father would have been proud. After he drove away, I stepped outside and looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright, scattered across the darkness. I thought about everything that had happened, every wound that had finally started to close. It wasn't a happy ending. Not exactly. But it was a clean one. And sometimes, that's all you need. The wind rustled through the trees, cool against my face. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. The next morning started with the sound of birds outside my window, soft and rhythmic, like they were reminding me that life goes on whether you're ready or not. I made coffee, the same way I always did. But it tasted different that day. Lighter somehow. The house felt lived in again, not haunted by the echoes of what had happened. I took it as a sign that peace, real peace, was finally settling in. Ethan called around noon. He said he wanted to stop by with some plans he'd drawn up for the lake house renovations. I could hear the excitement in his voice, and it warmed me. He was rebuilding, not just walls and decks, but himself. When he arrived, he looked like a man who'd finally shed an old skin. His eyes were brighter, and his shoulders didn't carry the same invisible weight anymore. He spread the blueprints on my kitchen table, explaining where he wanted to knock down walls, how he'd turn the small storage room into a reading nook overlooking the water. He spoke with such energy that I found myself smiling just listening to him. When he paused to take a sip of his coffee, he looked up at me and said he couldn't have made it through all this without me. I told him the truth, that he had done most of the work himself. Later that afternoon, we sat on the porch, watching the wind move through the trees. He told me he had met someone new, a woman named Grace who lived near the lake. She worked as a nurse and had been helping him paint the cabin. He spoke about her in a careful, quiet way, like someone who didn't want to jinx something good. I could tell this was different. There was no obsession, no blindness, just calm, steady affection. I told him I was happy for him, but to take things slow. He nodded, said he would rest. When he left that evening, I felt the kind of pride only a mother can feel. Not the pride of seeing her child succeed, but the deeper one that comes from knowing they've finally learned how to stand on their own. After he drove away, I cleaned the kitchen and found the envelope Amber had left behind, still tucked in the drawer. I thought about throwing it out, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed it in a box with Robert's journals and old letters. It wasn't forgiveness. Not really. But it was closure. That night, I slept without dreams. A few days later, Helen dropped by with a bottle of white wine and that look on her face that meant she had news. We sat on the porch while she poured 2 glasses. She said she'd gotten word from a friend in law enforcement that Amber had been spotted again. This time in Texas. She was reportedly using a new name, working as a freelance consultant. Helen waited for my reaction, but I just nodded. I told her it didn't matter anymore. She raised an eyebrow and said she was surprised at how calm I was. I told her I'd learned something from all of this, that some people never change. But that doesn't mean you have to carry them with you. She smiled and said that sounded like wisdom worth toasting. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in years, I laughed freely. That evening, as the sky faded into shades of rose and purple, I walked through the garden, checking the flowers that had started to bloom again. The lilies were taller this year, stronger. I thought about how, even after the hardest winters, things still grow back if you give them enough time and care. A week later, I got a letter in the mail addressed to the Polk family, with no return address. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note in neat handwriting. It said, "I've paid back what I took. The bank should confirm it soon. I'm sorry for everything. Don't worry. You'll never hear from me again." There was a cashier's check enclosed, matching almost exactly the amount that had been stolen from my accounts. I called Helen immediately, told her what had arrived. She said the bank would verify it, but that the gesture itself was surprising. I didn't know what to feel. Gratitude wasn't the right word, but maybe it was a kind of acknowledgement, a final line drawn between what had been and what would never be again. That night, I didn't tell Ethan about the letter. He was finally free, and I didn't want to pull him back into the past. I decided I'd deposit the check and donate most of it to the women's shelter downtown. I thought of all the women who had trusted the wrong people, believed in the wrong kind of love, and I knew that money could do more good in their hands than sitting in mine. The following weekend, Ethan invited me to the lake for dinner. I drove up just before sunset, and the view took my breath away. The cabin looked refreshed, freshly painted with a new porch swing that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Grace was there too, kind and soft-spoken, her smile warm but not forced. She hugged me when we met, and it felt genuine. We ate on the porch, the air thick with the smell of grilled corn and summer. The 3 of us talked for hours, About everything and nothing. I watched the way Grace looked at Ethan. And the way he looked back. There was no desperation. No pretending. Just two people trying to be better than their pasts. As the stars came out, Grace went inside to bring dessert. And Ethan turned to me. He said he didn't know if he'd ever truly get over what happened. But that he was finally okay with that. Some scars, he said, just remind you of how much stronger you are now. I squeezed his hand and told him his father would have said the same thing. On the drive home that night, the windows down and the warm summer air rushing in, I thought about everything that had changed. I had spent so long fighting to protect what mattered. But somewhere along the way, I had started learning how to let go too. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light came on automatically, casting a soft glow over the steps. I turned off the car and sat there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the night. The weight that had followed me for so long was finally gone. I went inside, locked the door, and stood in the living room for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guardian fighting shadows. I just felt like myself again. The house was still when I woke up. The kind of stillness that only comes when life has finally stopped spinning. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the first light of morning spread across the yard, and felt a quiet kind of gratitude I hadn't known in years. It wasn't joy. Not exactly. But something gentler. Like forgiveness you give yourself after too many battles. A few weeks passed in that steady rhythm. I spent my mornings tending to the garden, my afternoons baking pies or reading on the porch. Every so often, Ethan called to check in, his voice warm, lighter than I'd heard in years. He said Grace had helped him open up again, that she had a way of making silence feel peaceful instead of heavy. I told him she sounded like the right kind of woman. One afternoon, he stopped by, unannounced, holding a folder under his arm and wearing that same look of determination I used to see in Robert. He sat at the table and said he had something he wanted to show me. Inside the folder were legal papers, neatly arranged, with a few signatures already in place. They were divorce documents. He said the court date was set for the end of the month, and he wanted me to be there with him. I asked him if he was sure. He nodded without hesitation. He said he didn't want to drag it out anymore, that holding on to the past had cost him enough. He looked tired, but there was relief in his eyes too, the kind that comes when a long journey is finally nearing its end. When the day came, we drove together to the courthouse in Savannah. The air outside was warm and heavy, the sky washed in that pale summer blue that makes you feel small but safe. Ethan wore a simple gray suit, and I could tell he'd thought carefully about what this moment meant. As we walked up the courthouse steps, he took a deep breath and said he felt ready to start over. Inside, everything moved quickly. The judge was kind, professional, and patient. Amber wasn't there in person, just her lawyer, who looked bored and detached. I didn't look at her side of the room. Not once. Ethan answered every question clearly, his voice steady. When the judge declared the divorce finalized, he just nodded. No outburst. No tears. It was over. Afterward, we walked out into the sunlight, and Ethan stood there on the steps, breathing it all in like it was the first real air he'd taken in months. He turned to me and said he finally felt free. I told him, freedom doesn't always come from getting what you want, but from letting go of what you don't need. He smiled and said he understood now. We drove to a small diner on the edge of town for lunch. The waitress recognized me and asked about the bakery Robert and I used to run. I told her it was gone, but that Ethan was thinking about opening something new. Her face lit up, and she said people still missed our pies. When she left, Ethan looked at me thoughtfully. He said he had been thinking about reopening the bakery, not as a business, but as a community space, a place where people could come for coffee, conversation, maybe some comfort. He said he wanted to call it Langford's Kitchen. I felt my throat tighten. It was the same name Robert had once written on a napkin years ago when we dreamed of expanding. I told Ethan it was perfect. He smiled. And for the first time in so long, I could see a future in his eyes instead of pain. Over the next few weeks, we worked on the plan together. He found an old storefront downtown that needed a lot of love but had good bones. We spent our mornings there. Scrubbing, painting, sanding, filling the place with laughter and life again. Grace stopped by most afternoons with sandwiches. Her quiet presence, grounding us both. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at Ethan the way I used to look at Robert. Like she saw the best parts of him and wanted to protect them. When the bakery finally reopened, it wasn't grand or fancy, but it felt alive. People came in out of curiosity and stayed because it felt like home. There was a chalkboard wall where customers could write kind messages. And Ethan made sure every pot of coffee was always fresh. I baked pies again for the first time in years. And every time someone complimented them, I felt Robert close by, smiling. One evening, after closing, Ethan and I sat in the quiet shop. The last bit of sunlight filtered through the front windows, casting long shadows across the floor. He told me he had been reading through Robert's old journals, said they made him understand the kind of man he wanted to be. He looked down for a moment, then said softly that he was sorry for ever doubting me, for choosing the wrong side when it mattered most. I reached across the table and took his hand. I told him that forgiveness wasn't something he needed to ask for, that the moment he came home, it was already his. He smiled and said he hoped he could be the kind of parent one day that I had been. I laughed and told him to just be himself, because the world didn't need two of me. That night, when I got home, I stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of cars passing through town. I thought about how far we had come, how much pain we had endured, and yet somehow still found a way back to something good. The house didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a story that had finally reached its turning point. Before going inside, I looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet thank you to Robert, wherever he was, for the strength, the wisdom, and the patience to see this through. The porch light flickered once and stayed on, steady and warm. I took it as his way of saying he heard me. Inside, I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool, the air soft, and as I closed my eyes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, deep and absolute, wrapping around me like an old friend. The sound of rain woke me before dawn. Soft at first, then steady against the roof. I lay there for a while, listening to it, feeling that calm weight of a morning that doesn't need rushing. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pie I'd baked the night before. It was one of those small things that reminded me life could still feel warm even after everything that had passed. When I finally got up, I brewed coffee and turned on the small radio by the sink. The news played quietly in the background, the usual chatter about politics and weather, until I heard a familiar name that made me freeze. Jason Cole. The announcer said he had been arrested in California for financial fraud, part of a larger investigation into a string of scams across several states. They mentioned an accomplice who was wanted for questioning, a woman named Amber Langford. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at nothing. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I turned off the radio and sat down at the kitchen table. There was no joy, no shock, just a deep, hollow certainty that karma had finally caught up, exactly as it was meant to. Later that day, Ethan stopped by. The bell above the bakery door jingled as he walked in, rain dripping from his jacket. He looked at me, and I knew he had heard the same news. He didn't say anything for a while, just pulled out a chair and sat beside me. I poured him a cup of coffee, and we drank in silence. The world outside was gray, but inside the shop. The smell of fresh bread and sugar made everything feel almost safe. He finally spoke. His voice quiet but steady. He said he didn't feel angry anymore. Not even sad. He said, hearing her name on the news felt like reading about a stranger. Like she belonged to a story that wasn't his anymore. I told him that was exactly what she was now. Just a closed chapter. He nodded. Looking around the bakery. The chalkboard was covered in kind messages from customers. Phrases like, best pie in Savannah, and feels like home filled the board in different colors. He smiled. Then looked back at me and said, maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Choosing to build something beautiful on top of what was broken. I told him his father would have agreed with that. That afternoon, business picked up despite the weather. Regulars came in for their coffee, dripping umbrellas and all. And the place filled with laughter and warmth. I worked the counter while Ethan handled the kitchen. Every so often, he'd catch my eye and grin. And I'd see a flash of the boy he used to be before life got complicated. When the day finally slowed and the last customer left, we cleaned up together. As we were locking up, a young woman came to the door. She looked lost, soaked from the rain, maybe 20 years old. She said she had seen the help wanted sign in the window. Ethan glanced at me, and I could see that same kindness in him that Robert used to have. He handed her a towel and told her to come back tomorrow for an interview. She smiled, shy and grateful. After she left, he said maybe it was time to give someone else a second chance, the way life had given him one. When I got home that night, I turned on the lamp in the living room and sat by the window. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing. I made a cup of tea and picked up one of Robert's journals again. The page I opened to was dated more than 20 years ago. Written after the bakery first opened. He had written that the greatest satisfaction in life doesn't come from success or revenge, but from knowing you did the right thing, even when no one was watching. I closed the book and smiled. Maybe that's why things had turned out the way they did. I hadn't sought revenge. Not really. I had just stopped letting someone else write my story. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, warm and golden after so many gray days. I drove to the bakery early, stopping for fresh flowers to put by the register. When I walked in, Ethan was already there, humming to himself as he prepared the dough. He looked up and grinned when he saw me. I placed the flowers on the counter and told him they were for the customers who needed a bit of brightness. Around mid-morning, Helen came by. She ordered her usual black coffee and a slice of apple pie. She had heard about the arrest and said she wasn't surprised. She said people like Jason and Amber always think they're smarter than everyone else until they meet consequences. Then she added with a wink that karma sometimes has excellent timing. I laughed, and she squeezed my hand before leaving. By late afternoon, the bakery was full again. I watched people come and go. Couples sharing pastries, parents with children, old friends catching up over coffee. There was a quiet joy in seeing something I had helped build become a small refuge for others. That evening, Ethan and I stood outside the bakery, watching the sunset. The sign above the door glowed softly in the fading light. Langford's Kitchen. Beneath it, the words, family, faith, and second chances were painted in smaller letters. He had added that last part without telling me. But it felt right. He turned to me and said he finally understood why I never gave up. Even when things looked impossible. I told him I never learned how to quit. And besides, he was always worth fighting for. He smiled and said he hoped he'd make me proud. I told him he already had. When I got home, the house was quiet again. But it didn't feel empty. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. Watching the last light fade, the world outside was still, peaceful, like it had been waiting for this calm as long as I had. Somewhere, deep down, I knew this was the way things were meant to end. Not with noise or bitterness, but with quiet understanding. The kind that comes when everything has finally found its place. I finished my tea, turned off the light, and whispered good night to the stillness, knowing that tomorrow would come gentle and bright, just the way it should. A few months later, spring rolled into Savannah with that soft kind of beauty that sneaks up on you. The trees along the street outside my house were heavy with pink blooms, and the air smelled like rain and sunlight mixed together. The bakery had found its rhythm, and so had I. Every morning, I drove in early, opened the blinds, turned on the coffee pot, and watched the first few regulars trickle in. Life had become a series of small, ordinary miracles, and I was finally grateful enough to notice them. One morning, the bell over the bakery door rang, and Helen came in carrying the newspaper. She set it on the counter and pointed at a small article on the third page. It said that Jason Cole had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. There was one line at the end mentioning that his former accomplice, Amber Langford, was still missing, presumed to have fled overseas. Helen looked at me as if waiting for a reaction, but all I felt was a quiet finality. I told her she could throw the paper away. Later that afternoon, I was cleaning the tables when the phone rang. It was a Miami number. I hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was older, elegant, with a touch of exhaustion. The woman introduced herself as Gloria Blake. She said she had heard of me through a mutual acquaintance, that she wanted to ask a strange question. I told her to go ahead. She said a man named Jason Cole had once tried to court her, that he had spoken often about a woman named Amber, someone who had convinced him she was a wealthy widow. Gloria said she had recently been contacted by another young man using a familiar pattern. Smooth, charming, flattering. And it made her wonder if Amber was back. She said she wasn't sure why, but something in her gut told her to call me. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The idea that Amber might still be out there, using the same tricks, barely surprised me. I asked Gloria if she was in danger. She said not yet, that she had learned enough from her past to recognize trouble before it landed at her table. I told her to trust that instinct. Before hanging up, she thanked me and said she hoped she'd grow to be as sharp as me when she reached my age. I laughed softly and said, being sharp isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's what life makes you. That evening, after closing, I stayed behind at the bakery. The lights were dim, the air thick with the smell of sugar and coffee. I sat at one of the tables and looked around, listening to the silence that followed a busy day. There were crumbs on the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and a vase of fresh tulips by the window. Everything was simple, honest, earned. I thought about Amber then, not with anger, not even with pity, but with an odd kind of clarity. She had been clever, but not wise. Ambitious, but hollow. Maybe that was her curse. I wondered if she'd ever understand what she'd lost. Not just money or safety, but something deeper. Something that no amount of scheming could replace. I hoped, in some quiet part of me, that she would. When I got home, the house was quiet as always. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window. The moon was full that night, bright enough to paint silver shadows across the yard. I watched them move with the wind, thinking about all the seasons this house had seen. Robert's laughter, Ethan's first steps, the sound of arguments that turned into lessons, heartbreaks that became stories. Every wall here carried pieces of us. A car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the porch. For a brief second, I thought of that night long ago when Amber had driven away, full of arrogance and certainty. It felt like a lifetime ago, a chapter written in another language. I took a sip of tea and let the memory dissolve. The next morning, Ethan called. He said he and Grace were engaged. His voice trembled a little when he said it, like he was afraid to believe it was real. I smiled into the phone and told him he deserved every bit of happiness coming his way. He said they wanted to get married at the lake house. Small and simple. Just family and a few friends. I told him that sounded perfect. In the weeks that followed, we threw ourselves into planning. Grace's laughter filled the bakery. And even Helen helped pick out decorations. There was a sweetness in the air. The kind that only comes from love that's been earned the hard way. On the day of the wedding, the lake shimmered under a wide blue sky. I watched Ethan standing there, sunlight in his hair, and I felt my heart swell with something I hadn't felt since Robert passed. Pure joy. After the ceremony, when the guests had gone and the sun was setting, Ethan came to stand beside me on the dock. He looked out at the water, then at me. He said he didn't know if he could ever repay me for all I'd done. I told him he already had. Seeing him whole again was more than enough. That night, when I drove home, the air was cool and soft. The world quiet in that perfect way it gets after something sacred. I parked in the driveway and sat for a while, looking at the porch light, glowing steady and golden. I thought about everything that had happened. Every hurt. Every lesson. Every small miracle that had led us here. I realized then that strength isn't loud. It's not in the shouting or the fighting, or even the revenge. It's in the quiet decisions. The moments you choose, peace over bitterness, grace over pride. It's in the way you keep showing up, day after day, even when no one's watching. Before going inside, I looked up at the sky, full of stars, and whispered a small prayer of thanks for all of it. Even the hard parts. Maybe especially the hard parts, because they're what had shaped me into who I was now. And if anyone ever asks, I'll tell them this. Sometimes life will take everything you have just to hand it back in a form you never expected. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom, but from time, truth, and the quiet strength of knowing you did what was right. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel small, remember this. It only takes one choice, one call, one act of courage to take your life back. So stay, listen, and keep your light on. You never know who might find their way home because of it.